You'll want to store all of your camping equipment in a location, probably your garage, with some shelves, and try to keep all the equipment together in the same general location so that when you're getting ready to leave, you're not having to look in a whole bunch of different places, which could mean you might easily forget something. Make a checklist of the things that you bring on your trip. I do it in an Excel spreadsheet, and I also keep a separate list of all the items that I need to charge and items that I keep in my dedicated storage but are things that I need to replenish, like paper towels or plastic trash bags and things like that. And I also check off all of those items to make sure that I've got everything at the right level. You don't want to get out on your camping trip and realize that you left one of your sleeping bags at home, or you don't have any trash bags to throw your garbage in. So it's just better to have that list and to check everything off before you walk out the door, and so that you're very comfortable that you've packed everything that you need for the trip into your vehicle. A day or two before I leave, I charge all my electronics. I make sure that I've got the sufficient amount of propane fuel for the trip. Do I have spare batteries for the lights that I use that require batteries? And do I have fuel in my lanterns? Then if I am bringing firewood from home, I buy that at a local grocery store. I buy the food that I'm going to need for the trip. You fill up your water containers and freeze water bottles, so you've got a good supply of ice for your cooler. Then I consider, have I bought any new equipment between the last trip and this trip that I really should set up, like a tent, just to make sure that it's functioning properly, so you don't get out and find that something that you brought has a missing part or it just doesn't work. I always gas up the day before and make sure that your vehicle has been serviced recently, so that you really minimize the chance of something going wrong while you're making that trip out to the camp area. When I load up my vehicle, I always put in the large, heavy items first and then fill in around them with the smaller things. I just carry, I think, 4 different containers that are oversized. My tent, my cooler. I have one storage bin for all of my cooking types of things, and then I have a separate hard-sided protective container for all of my lanterns and my lighting and everything. And I do pack my lighting in little bags that are like felt or vinyl that give them some layer of protection so that they stay newer looking for a longer length of time. If carrying heavy items is hard for you when you get out, or either moving things from the garage to your vehicle or from the vehicle to your campsite, consider, where you can, breaking down into smaller containers. Even your tent could be put in separate bags to bring the weight down. Or you could also purchase a dolly or some sort of a pull cart to help you to move the heavier items to your vehicle. Good planning reduces mistakes and oversights, and it builds confidence, and you're going to get better at each trip as you go. But having that list to make sure all of the things that you need get into your vehicle, I can't overemphasize how important that is, because you just don't want to get out to the campsite and realize that something's either not working or you didn't charge things that are important to have operating, like lights at night, those kinds of things. And if you've done all that properly, then when you get out, you're not dealing with a bunch of crazy things that that come upon you, and you can just focus on having a great time on your camping trip. If you own a dog, you might consider bringing it on the camping trip with you. Many people do, and you see them all over campgrounds. You'll want to check to make sure the campground allows you to bring a dog. Usually, if they do allow it, though, they want you to have it on a leash, usually 6 foot or less, in the campsite. And when you take it out for walks, obviously have it on a leash, because they don't want to have your pet roaming into another campsite or something. So that rule is good for everybody. And you'll want to check on the site where you're making the reservation. They'll usually have the rules there about your pet that you want to bring on the trip. One caveat, though, is many trails do not allow dogs to go out, and some do. And so you'll want to check to see whether the trails that you want to hike on that trip allow your pet if you do bring it. If they don't, then you have an issue where, unless you have somebody that can stay with your dog while you're out doing the hike, you really can't go out and do that hike because you can't leave your dog by themselves at the campsite. And then another issue, especially if you have a smaller pet, is predators when you're out on a hike or sometimes even in your campsite. You'll want to pay very close attention to your pet to make sure that they're always safe and secure. If the weather's going to be cold at night, you'll also want to consider your pet's comfort and maybe having a coat for the pet, especially if they're a smaller dog and they don't have a heavy coat. You'll want to make sure that they stay warm at night. And again, don't ever leave your dog alone in the campsite. Now, when you arrive at the campsite, you'll enter into it, and sometimes you'll see a kiosk out front where they'll check you in. Sometimes you go right to your campsite, and so then somebody might come by later on in a golf cart or something to talk to you about their policies on campfires and things like that. Normally, you'll pay ahead of time when you do your reservation online, but there are some sites, especially some of the ones that are out like on a first come first serve basis, there may not even be a camp host there, and they have an honor system where they'll have an envelope that you fill out and you put cash inside and put it inside of a mail slot at the entrance to the site, and you'll want to take care of that right when you first arrive. And sometimes they'll have like a QR code where you can actually pay by credit card online. But check out the rules for the site. And it is a cash only thing. You'll want to have the exact amount of cash with you on the trip. Also, you'll want to bring a pen so that you can fill out the envelope when you arrive. Another thing you might want to do is check in with the camp host if you need to buy firewood and they sell it there at the site. Otherwise, make sure if you didn't buy it when you left on your trip, make sure you buy it at a local store on your way in. And if the campsite has showers, oftentimes they require a token, and sometimes those have to be purchased from the camp host. So that's another thing you could deal with the host. Now, when you get to your campsite, take a few minutes to really look it over and see how you want to set up the area. And you'll get better at this over time, but a couple of basic rules. Oftentimes you'll have a picnic table and you'll have a fire ring at the campsite. And then if it's in bear or mountain lion country, sometimes they'll give you a big metal storage locker for keeping your food in that the animals can't get to. And you'll want to set your tent up as much distance as you can away from those areas because you don't want to have any smells of food or anything going on near your tent and the food areas. Another thing to look at is the trees in your site. Take a look up in the air and see if there's some big trees that might have some dead branches or the potential for something that could fall down during the trip. So you don't want to set your tent up under a big tree that has some dead limb. Other telltale signs are if you see dead tree limbs and things laying on the ground around the tree, that might be an indicator that things are happening. Also, look at the health of the trees and whether one is leaning a little bit that might look like it's unstable, that sort of thing. But in an established campground, you're not usually going to have to deal with those types of things, but it's a good check. Now, when you've looked at where the best location is for your tent, you also want to make sure that that area has fairly flat ground. You don't want to be pitching your tent on a place that has a lot of angle to it, because you want your sleeping area to be as flat as possible. If there's a little bit of a pitch and you discover it at night, make sure that when you put your head direction down, your head is higher than your feet, because you don't want to have a whole bunch of blood rushing to your head at night. Another thing to consider is if it does rain, you want to make sure that your tent is located at a spot where water's not going to gather. So if there's like the lowest place at a campsite, you don't want to have the tent right where the rain's going to all gather to. And sometimes you'll see ruts that go along an area that show, well, gosh, that's where the rain is probably flowing through. And so just look for those types of areas. That's more probably of a dispersed camping thing. Normally there's a lot of flat areas in the campsites, but again, you wanted to, I think I mentioned it in an earlier episode, when you're doing your searches online for a site, you want to make sure you find a site that has enough room for all of your tents and your vehicles that are coming, and you want to look through to see if there's shade for the picnic table if possible. And so hopefully all that makes your site a good candidate when you arrive, and then you hopefully can can find a good spot to put your tent. Also, at this point, it's usually pretty hard to figure out from looking at the maps of the campground, but I'll tell you a story. Earlier this year, I stayed at Joshua Tree National Park, which is out in a desert, beautiful boulders and mountains around the campsite where I stayed. And my campsite was positioned just east of a big mountainside, and then across the road there were more sites on the other side of the road, and the sun went across, and yeah, during the day you're more likely to be out and away from your tent, so in the mornings are usually when the sun's coming up, there's not a lot of heat. But around 3:30 the sun went down enough over the mountain just next to my campsite so that I had great shade and it wasn't overly hot in the late afternoon. But while I was sitting there in my comfort and in the shade, I was noticing across the street, they were having direct sunlight coming down on them till about 5 or 6 o'clock at night. So I picked up a couple of hours of extra shade and comfort over my neighbors. And so if it's possible, take that into account too, if you can select a site that's going to give you a little more shade. But again, that's probably a hard thing to see, but just something to keep in mind. And the last point I'll make about getting to your campsite is try to plan to arrive at your campsite at least about 3 hours before sunset. If possible, you don't want to arrive like at dark and now you're going through all of the setup with your tent and all of your things, and maybe you've brought some great lighting and you can get that set up, but it's much better to make the selection of where to put your tent and to get everything set up while you've got good sunlight. After you get everything set up and now you're ready to enjoy yourself on the trip, do keep a couple of things in mind that are just good etiquette for being around all the other people at your campground. First, never walk into anybody's campsite without permission. People are all strangers to each other, and it's certainly great to be friendly and maybe you start up a conversation with somebody, but you just never walk into somebody's site unless they give you permission to do that. And when you're walking like to a bathroom or something, always stay on the trails and the paths. Don't shortcut through somebody's site. Nobody wants to see somebody walking through their campsite. When you're playing music or you're talking, try to keep it at a level that's not also being enjoyed by people 15 sites away. And campgrounds will usually have rules about what time of the day and night you have to keep your voice down, usually from 10 p.m. and your music. Usually it's from like 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. or something in there, because those are the normal sleep times for people. Children, keep in mind, children do go to bed early, sometimes as early as like 8 or 8:30. And then also people wake up very early often to see sunrise or to go out on a hike and to enjoy the hike before the sun becomes too intense during the day. So a lot of people are keeping early hours and going to bed early when they're camping. If you have an RV and you need to run the generator for a while, a campground will probably have rules over what times that's allowed, but please be respectful beyond those times. Before you go into your tent to retire for the evening, scan the campsite to see what you'd be comfortable with if it rained that night, or even if there's a heavy dew. I do things like cook stove, I'll fold it up and I'll throw a dish towel over the top of it. Chairs, like my canvas chair, I wouldn't want to get dew on that. So sometimes if you put it under a tarp, or you can even bring some items into your tent with you. When I take my shoes off to go into the tent, at the end of the evening, I do bring my shoes just inside the tent, because you don't want to have a critter taking up residence in your shoes during the night. Things like firewood, you can keep it under a tarp so that it doesn't get wet. Or the other location for storing things is in your vehicle at night. If I come for a few days and I might have multiple firewood bundles, I'll only bring out the bundles that I need for each night as they go. I leave my other firewood in the car until I'm ready. Animals have an incredible sense of smell, many times that of humans, and you will probably get different types of critters going through the site at night, whether it's just a mouse or a raccoon. You never want to leave any food out during the night, even your trash bags. So if you're in bear country, use those storage lockers that they provide. And then if you don't have something like that, then you need to use your vehicle, or make sure also that your trash gets thrown into a dumpster at the end of each day. And never bring any food items over to your tent area where you're sleeping at night. You don't want to have any animal come in and start to smell things over in the tent area where you're sleeping. And that includes, don't eat a candy bar and then leave the candy bar wrapper in your tent area. That would just, the animal's going to pick up that scent. And then it goes beyond food. Items that you have like toothpaste or soap or chapstick or lotions, those types of things that have scent, animals might mistake that as food. So those items also need to be put either in that storage locker if the site provides one, or in your car. And lastly, I would say is, get in the habit of keeping your site tidy and clean. Now, at the end of the trip, when I'm looking to tear everything down to eventually get it back in storage at my home, I do try to pack things so that when I do get home, I can move them right to the storage, and there doesn't have to be like a repacking step at home, just to minimize that time. Now, if your tent maybe gets dirty, or maybe you're dealing with rain, you've got some items that are high moisture content, you do want to dry them out before you fold them up and bag them at home, because you don't want mold to happen. So if I have room in my vehicle, I'll usually, like in my tent, let's say it has some moisture on it, I'll pack that last and then put that maybe on top of my other things in the vehicle. And if I have room, I don't even need to really fold that up before I go home, because I'm just going to unfurl the whole thing again on the driveway and dry it out during the day when there's sun. I also usually will pack up my tent or tables last so that I can use those as a place to roll up sleeping bags and put things away where I don't have to use or put anything down on the dirt within the campsite. And then before you leave the campsite, do a walkthrough to make sure you haven't left any personal belongings behind, and also look for any type of small trash or garbage that you might have missed, and get that cleaned up in your plastic garbage bag, which you can then toss on your way out as you're leaving the campground. And somebody new is going to come and be in that campsite usually a couple of hours after you leave, so you don't want them to have to come in and do your garbage detail before they start enjoying their trip. On your way home, or after you get home, before everything on the trip becomes more of a distant memory, make some notes about what went well on the trip. What did you bring that you probably didn't need to bring, or what did you forget that you'd want to make sure you brought on the next trip? Those are great notes to have for when you're planning your next trip. When you arrive home, of course, you'll have to air out or dry out any wet items. You'll have some certain things that need to be washed. And then when I store my equipment, I do a couple of things. First of all, the things that I don't normally bring, only maybe when I have extra people with me, I store all that in one dedicated area, and then the things that I bring every time in another area. When I'm buying little canvas bags, I try to vary the color so that when you're trying to identify items on the shelf, the color and the size and shape will help you to identify different things. And then as much as you can, try to, and I'll use the tent as an example, I've seen on different videos where people come out on their campsite and they realize that they put their tent poles or their tent stakes in a separate location from their tent, and then they just forgot them on the trip. So if you can, keep everything all in the same bag so that that's an impossible thing to happen. Now, I do keep a lot of supply of tent pegs, tent stakes in my tool bag, along with the mallet that I use for that. So, but I never forget my tool bag, so I'm not worried about that. But to the extent you can, everything that needs to function together, try to keep it together. In the next episode, which is the 10th episode of my series, I'm going to cover day hikes and what to consider when you're doing day hikes and the different types of equipment that you'll need. And if you're enjoying this content, please press the like button and consider subscribing to this channel so that you can keep up with all of my content. And I'll see you on the next one.